Hi, today I'm here with Meido Roshi. Thank you for being with us today, Roshi.
My pleasure.
Could you spend a few moments telling us who you are and what your relationship to the Zen is, kind of what sort of teaching activities you're involved in right now?
Sure. I currently serve as the Abbot of Korenji, which is a Rinzai Zen monastery in Wisconsin. And our lineage was transmitted to the West by Omori Sogen, so a very famous Rinzai Zen master who died 1997, I think. Excuse me for not remembering. But basically, 20th century Rinzai Zen master. And he was known for not only being a great Zen master, he was also a master calligrapher in the tradition of Yamoka Teshu. And he originally was a swordsman. He was a martial arts teacher.
Hmm.
So his emphasis in training was something that encompassed those disciplines, traditional Zen, of course, but also physical culture and fine arts, and the
Hmm.
ways that those things, when they're practiced together, can, really refine the human being in unique ways, very powerful ways. And I think especially modern folks, for
Hmm.
example, who may be physically sedentary and can benefit from something like that approach. So that was his teaching, what he called Zen Kensho, Zen the sword and the brush. And that's the approach which we have carried on here in the West. Our lineage has been active since the 70s, but I guess for many decades flew under the radar. Many people didn't know anything about us or that we even existed. But finally, we were able to establish a true Sodo training monastery here in the upper Midwest, the heartland of North America. And that's really the focus of my activity. I have a background in martial arts and was a professional Aikido teacher for many years. I still have a hand in that. But I'm obviously ordained in the Rinzai Zen tradition and teaching here in Wisconsin as well as at our events, for our larger community worldwide.
Great. So can you talk about where you were born and a little bit about your early childhood, if possible?
Sure. I was actually born in Oklahoma, although I have no connection to it. My father was in graduate school there at the time. But my family and where I grew up actually is New Jersey. Everyone's from New Jersey. Um, I grew up, I'd say, most of my childhood in southern New Jersey, in basically next to a wilderness area called the Pine Barrens. My father's work was with the state of New Jersey, involved with the planning and preservation of that Highlands National Preserve, basically.
I,
So it was an interesting childhood and
yeah.
very
I'm so
intelligent and brilliant parents. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I have to ask: have you seen the famous Sopranos episode, "The Pine
Oh
Barrens"?
yeah, of course. And Sopranos is an amazing series too, which takes place in quite a different part of New Jersey. But yeah, there's that
Yeah.
Pine Barrens scene, which was not filmed in the Pine Barrens at all,
Oh,
because
okay.
the Pine Barrens are completely flat and there's no stone at all. It
Interesting.
looks like they filmed that one in about North Jersey or New York State.
Anyway, I'm so sorry. That was the worst possible non
No,
sequitur.
I'm
But
a big fan. Big
yeah.
fan.
Okay. Please carry on.
Well, so that's it. So I grew up in New Jersey and went to Rutgers University, did a undergraduate degree in religious studies, and during that time I was able to go overseas through the Antioch, what was then the Antioch University Education Abroad program. They have a Buddhist studies program in Bodh Gaya, India. Bodh Gaya, famous place, of course, where the Buddha was enlightened.
Mhm.
So I participated in that, knowing I had an interest in Buddhism and was able to meet really eminent, amazing teachers there. That was really the beginning of my path, and I eventually found my way to Rinzai Zen, actually through Toda Sensei, the gentleman who did the calligraphy behind me. He's now passed away as well, but he was a Rinzai Zen lay master as well as a Aikido master who
Mhm.
had transplanted himself to Chicago. So after I got out of university, I followed him. I went there, trained in his training hall for 7 years, and that was where I began the training also in this lineage of Omori Sogen, which we are still trying to plant here in North America.
So, would you say you had a middle class upbringing? Was it a two-parent home? Did you have siblings? Like what?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say it was a very stable upbringing, and I wouldn't call us rich by any means, but my father worked again for the state and later for the federal government, Department of the Interior. So we never wanted for anything. Yeah, and both of my parents are been struck by their intelligence and their openness. Even as I pursued my own directions, which had very little connection to our upbringing. Even in a religious sense, we were brought up very loosely in a Catholic sort of background. But I never had any resistance from them. I'm very grateful for the freedom they afforded me as I pursued my life's wishes and so on. But yeah, just a wonderful family. I cannot speak of any trauma or really anything negative about my upbringing. I'm very lucky in that regard. And I have siblings, two brothers, older brother and a younger brother, and then a younger sister as well.
You stated your relationship to Catholicism was casual. Were you a believer? Did you believe in God?
I've talked about this before when folks have asked me about how I got into Zen and so on. From the earliest time I can remember, I was somehow of a religious character or spiritual. And a lot of that was focused on nature. But I would say from a very young age, I guess I was Christian. I remember spending Christmas Eve each year, very young, kindergarten or younger, in an ecstatic state, praying. Not ecstatic because of the presents the next morning, but because it was a liminal time. It was a time where I felt like I was in touch with something deeper or sacred. So I guess that was just my character, was to be oriented that way. And Catholicism was my only exposure to spirituality. But again, it was very casual. We were not regular churchgoers. Mm-hmm. I think at some point I wanted to be a priest and realized fairly quickly after that it wasn't what I was interested in.
Was that as a child or a teenager?
As a child. I wanted to connect with something larger. I wanted to talk to God. And I realized at some point that the priest didn't really do that the way that Jesus did. So I guess I wanted to be more like Jesus than the clergy. But I often think, if I had run into a member of a Catholic contemplative order, maybe a Trappist or a Carmelite or something like that, and had a chance to speak with someone like that, maybe I would have connected with that and seen that there was indeed this profound experiential approach and practice approach within that faith, rather than just sort of the doctrinal or dogmatic approach that I started to discern in the activities of the priesthood.
Did you mentioned you guys lived near a wilderness area? Did you spend a lot of time hiking around there?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time camping, hiking, and not even just that wilderness area, but we lived in a rural area. So behind our house, for example, is a stretch of forest and fields, which became quite a significant place to me. So again, nature would be the place that I found some sense, or as many people do, I know this is not unique at all, but some sense of that sacredness or sacred space, or somehow some feeling of being in touch with the transcendent, or something which was just behind the veil, in a way that became more compelling to me than church, for example.
Did you do any martial arts or have any kind of inclination towards Eastern culture in any manner?
Yeah, so I've tried to think back, how did I actually find out about this stuff? And I realized it was quite young. I mean, when I realized that the church wasn't really the direction I was going to go, but I still had this sense of wanting to devote my life to spirituality somehow. I guess the way I've been able to trace it is fairly young, so in grade school, middle school perhaps, I was exposed to the transcendentalists, so Emerson, Thoreau, and so on. And because of them, I learned about something called the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. Okay, so now I'm reading.
Would this be high school, middle school, high school?
I think middle school, okay. Maybe early high school. I think earlier, middle school. I remember having a copy of the Upanishads in my hand, and that led me to, again, those wonderful Penguin Classics paperbacks that you could find in bookstores all the time there. At some point, I had a copy of the Dharmapada in my hand, and that struck me. That struck me profoundly. So from that moment onward, my focus was Buddhism, and I had no understanding what the different schools of Buddhism were, what was Zen, what was Rinzai Zen, Soto Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, no idea at all. But I started to read voraciously, just Buddhism as much as I could. So by the time I was ready, through high school and then into college, by the time I got to college, I knew I wanted to be a religious studies major and I wanted to focus on Buddhism. But I also was not I am not a scholar or an academic at all. I did not have any interest in that direction. I wanted to practice. So I had lots of fantasies of what kind of form that might take. Living in a monastery here, following this guru there. It eventually did end up taking some form, but not something I could have expected.
Did you meditate in middle school or high school at all?
Tried to.
Formally, yeah.
Tried to. Yeah, as many of us start, right? We try to read something and work it out. Um, Meditation and lying in bed every night and focusing on the breath and trying to see where that would take me. And I had sort of a tendency to work myself into what I would now call ecstatic states. So I think I wasn't so grounded in what I was doing. It was much later when I was exposed to proper meditation instruction that I realized how much I really had to work on and how much my spirituality had just been intellectual or conceptual. But yeah, I knew from the beginning I needed to do something, practice something, not just believe something. So that, I guess, right from those early days when I started to become disenchanted with Catholicism, at least as I had seen it, that was really the guiding principle.
Did you so when I was interviewing Corey Hess, we
Great
talked a little
interview.
bit about thank you. We talked a little bit about how Star Wars was probably at least some maybe unconsciously influential on us, because if you think about it, as a child, I mean, Star Wars, it was so hard for me to overemphasize how influential that movie was to me, because I was 5 when I saw the first one, and then a couple years later. And so as I was developing as a human being, it was the primary mythology of my life. I mean, that may sound ridiculous, but it really was.
Yeah.
And the whole Jedi, let go of your thoughts, follow your emotions. I mean, I think it really planted a seed. Do you see any of that in yourself, maybe, or?
Oh, absolutely. And Corey and I are friends, so we've talked about this stuff too. And we're all close enough in generation, I think. Yeah, we all wanted to be a Jedi. We all wanted to find a master who would help open our eyes to the mysteries of life, and also the sort of chivalrous or martial aspect of that too. Not just to be a Jedi, but a Jedi Knight, or an Arthurian Knight, or in my childhood was when Dungeons and Dragons came out, and you can tell a lot about people from that generation when you ask them, well, what kind of character did you want to be? So I wanted to be a paladin, a holy knight, maybe a little bit of magic too, but mostly to gallop off with a sword and find the Holy Grail and so on. So yeah, those archetypes go deep, don't they? And I think a lot of us have that questing spirit, which they express. And for me, it was something I was able to harness. It's something I still feel motivated by. I mean, talking with Corey recently, actually, he recently visited Korenji, and he likes to sometimes describe sesshin goers, trainees at the intensive Zen retreats, as spiritual heroes. It's a term he's used. And that resonates with me. The heroic aspect of what we do, the heroism of the bodhisattva path, not a sterile or negative self-negation, but a heroic expansion and extension of energy for the sake of others. It all comes down to that, however we express it. But back to Star Wars, absolutely. I wanted to meet my Yoda. I guess I did. Ultimately, I did.
Yeah, and I remember the first time we went to a Japanese restaurant as a kid. I remember I'm like, yes, there's something here. I'm not really sure what to think about transmigration, but like this, because it was a very traditional, the architecture and so forth, and it was not. I didn't feel like it was the first time I'd seen it.
I felt the same way. It resonated with me. And actually, my first teacher, my refuge teacher, was Tibetan Buddhist, but I felt no connection with the Tibetan cultural aspects, even the art. It just didn't strike me, but the Japanese stuff did. But are we relatively close in age? I'm 54.
I'm 49.
49. Okay, I'm older than you. Do you remember the miniseries Shogun?
Yes, that was also.
That was another one, right?
That was after the sushi restaurant, but yeah, that just blew my mind. Yeah.
And that was a time period when Japan was in its economic ascendance, and culturally, we're seeing Japanese stuff and samurai and all kinds of things in American movies. And I guess that was the timing for that too. it made sense that Zen would resonate.
Mhm. Awesome. So through your kind of teenage years, would you say there was do you think you were already having a great doubt generated, or was could you describe that if you feel comfortable kind of going there?
Yeah, I mean, so at the root of what I call the kind of spiritual orientation or character or nature that I seem to have from a very young age was just deep, pressing existential angst and even terror.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess for some people, those questions of meaning are so pressing that they almost can't function.
Mm-hmm.
And I was probably one of those people. And also extremely introverted, um, prone perhaps to depression. It was a potent and not always useful or pleasant mix to have within one's character.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that really sort of locked in the Buddhist path for me is that when I actually did start doing genuine meditation practice, actually received instruction, started going to retreats and so on, the kind of cycles of deep depression that I had experienced through my life actually stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And what also stopped was this experience of waking up in the middle of the night with just existential, nameless panic. That was something I had suffered from my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Once I started sitting, and I'm not talking about koan practice or just basic early days of sitting, all of that stopped. So I was so amazed that
Mm-hmm.
I could inhabit a different space or I could function actually. And there seemed to be a path. It was presented to me that here's a way to address those questions. You don't just have to suffer with them. There's a way to go into them and even to resolve them. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess that was the moment I was hooked
Mm-hmm.
by that point.
Beautiful. So could you talk about what your undergraduate college experience was like? Did you go through a party phase? Did you
Phase.
yeah.
Again, as someone who's pretty introverted and didn't think of myself as terribly popular in high school, I look back, I realized I had a lot of great friends, but college was a time for social blossoming for me, and I began to realize that I did enjoy people's company. They did enjoy my company. I learned how to do things like drink, perhaps too much. I didn't go to class as much as I should have. I look at those years in some sense as a waste of opportunities. I wish I had gotten serious about studying Japanese for now. For example, how wonderful that would be. What a great asset that would be for me now. And I just didn't do it. But I guess for me, college was that time that I needed to sort of incubate my personality and gain some confidence that I could actually function in the world. And at the same time, I made amazing connections there that led me to Zen, that led me to meditation. Rutgers is a big university. I ended up finding out about the program in India there. I ended up participating in a meditation group there, which led me to do retreats with Shen Yun, the great Chan master. Amazing connection. I mean,
Wow, I didn't know that.
oh yeah, he was
That's
actually my first Zen retreats were with him.
that's amazing. I had no idea.
Yeah,
Was that pretty influential? I mean, did you
yeah,
appreciate what you were seeing at that point?
probably. I mean, certainly not. I mean, there were. He was a remarkable teacher. I did 3 7-day retreats with him, and I spent a few extra days living in the Chan Center there in Queens. That was my exposure to him. But he was present then. He was teaching, and I was struck by how it's a classic city. It's a classic ability that arises out of training, according to the old text. But he was one of those people. When he spoke, you could have a room full of 30 people at the retreat, and you felt he was speaking precisely to you and addressing specifically your problems. And every person in the room felt that way. That was remarkable to me.
Mhm.
And yet, I would have been so fortunate to follow him or any of the other teachers I met. That the affinity just wasn't there. I wasn't struck with the feeling that this is the person I have to follow. When I later on did meet who would become my main Zen teachers, I did have that feeling. So I have no explanation for it. We can call it karma. But one connection I'm really grateful for. Guagu, I'm sure you know of. Chan teacher who
Mhm.
now lives in Florida.
Mhm.
At that time, he and I were both 22 years old. He had not been ordained yet,
Mhm.
certainly not gone to Taiwan or lived as a monk yet, as he later did. But we were there at those retreats together. I have an old photo of he and I, next to each other.
Interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah, and we're in touch now. We reestablished contact some years ago. Now, of course, he's one of Shenying's dharma heirs and has amazing teaching activity. So again, although that wasn't the teacher I would follow, even there were some interesting dharma connections which continue to flower, for which I'm so grateful. So
Mhm.
I just kind of keep floating along and letting the doors open. They seem to keep doing
So those early session, or they probably weren't called sessions, but
Yeah, Chan retreats. Chan
chat
retreats.
retreats. I mean, was there any samadhi generated at that point? Were you having any little openings?
It's interesting. So what I now recognize as different kinds of samadhi experiences I had when I was young. I had when I was a kid, spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
I had some interesting experiences at those retreats, which pointed me to or showed me the potential of the training. I had no great enlightenment, awakening experiences, openings, anything like that. But I could say that I died during those retreats. Absolutely. The physical discomfort, the upwelling of everything I had carried my whole life was all right there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I survived them, honestly. And somehow I kept coming back, and I did 3 of them.
Mm-hmm. Were they 7 days?
7 days, yeah. And I can't express how difficult it was. And I know that's something that everyone experiences. And I try to let my students today know when they have difficulties in sesshin that we understand. I understand. I've been through that. But at the same time, again, literally, I felt like I died each of those sessions. Afterward, I felt so light, as if something had dropped off that I'd been carrying my whole life. So it's often been said that in the beginning of one's Zen training, you may have heard this image expressed, but it's like a wooden sculpture. You have just the block, the rough block, and the early stages of the sculpting, you're taking off big chunks.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like that to me. I was
Mm-hmm.
losing big chunks of something. So I guess although the experiences were so difficult, it increased my faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see the tremendous benefit. One experience I remember vividly coming out after one of those retreats, Queens, New York. So you walk out from the Chan Center, I'm going to the train. It's not, dirty streets, trash around, and a piece of shiny foil on the ground, and suddenly being transfixed by the transcendent beauty,
Mm-hmm.
purity of the light playing off that. I look back now and I realize I was in a samadhi condition as I left that place, and I was moving through space to walk to the train. It's not awakening, it's nothing terribly significant, but somehow the training was changing me, and it was showing me that I could change how I see things. So remarkable. Again, I guess that was another hook. Although Shenyang was not my teacher in the end, he hooked me in some ways, and I had tremendous faith and confidence in
Were you having any emotional upwellings?
him. That was never my thing.
Yeah.
I know it's very common. A lot of my students, even especially recently, for some reason, seem to be having a lot of emotion stuff coming up.
Mm.
I think, for whatever reason, I don't, for example, I never had a great sadness coming up, needing to weep or anger, that kind of stuff. For me, it was always much more the pressing existential questioning, which haunted me and oppressed me.
So, was your trip to India during your undergraduate experience or afterwards?
Yeah, my junior year.
Okay. So did you actually attend classes in India?
So the Buddhist Studies program in Bodh Gaya is a remarkable program. A lot of neat people have come through that, actually. We lived in the Burmese monastery, which is walking distance to the Bodhi tree. And Bodh Gaya, as you probably know, is a international pilgrimage center. So you have Tibetan temples, Japanese temples, Thai, Burmese, you name it, it's all there. And we were living in the monastery doing a mixture of practice. So we had amazing teachers come to us. Anagarika Munindra, the teacher of Joseph Goldstein, for example, came, great Theravada meditator. And we trained with him for a month. He was living there in the monastery with us. And later on, Chokin Nyima Rinpoche, great Tibetan master, Dzogchen and Mahamudra master, came and he was living with us for a month. So we had the opportunity to take teachings and to put them into practice. But at the same time, we were supposed to be doing academic study. I took a little bit of Tibetan language, doing Buddhist philosophy. There were course offerings for which I got credit, academic credit. So kind of interesting thing. But my experience there, actually, I don't look on the academic side at all as being meaningful because essentially the second day I was in India, I got struck with severe dysentery, as many people do, but I never got rid of it. I lost about 25 to 30 pounds over the course of my time there. At one point, I think I was close to a coma. And in the end, I ended up with tuberculosis.
How tall are you? Just to put the weight loss into context.
5'10".
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was.
That's a lot of weight then.
It was pretty severe, yeah. Of course, a lot of it may have been dehydration. So for me, it was a place that I died. There was a moment where I was pretty sure I wasn't going to leave there. And that was an amazing confront to have in the context of Dharma teachings in Bodh Gaya. And to be able to take refuge under the Bodhi tree. I mean, I'm deeply touched and I need to return to that place at some point. But coming out from that experience, when then I returned to university, I ended up being able to graduate and finish school and everything, recovering from tuberculosis along the way. That was a time I had done some martial arts training before that, but that was a time I started to take that physical side of the training the body much more seriously.
From the standpoint of you wanted to heal.
Yeah, I wanted to be healthy again. Yeah, I wanted to breathe again. Mm. And that's what led me ultimately to meet Toyoda Sensei, the lay Zen teacher, who was also an Aikido teacher. And in him, I saw somebody who could do it all. Like, I could do martial arts with him, and I can do Zen with him. He has it all going on at his place, his training hall that he's established in the United States. I don't even have to go overseas again because I was scared to do that. So I guess that experience of sickness was not only really meaningful just, for my own development, but also it pointed me in a direction of physicality and physical discipline, again, for health, that I might not have gone in. I think if that had not happened, I probably would have ended up going back to Kathmandu and ordaining in the Tibetan tradition, or at least living there. But that door closed for me.
Was Bodh Gaya after the Chan retreats?
No, the Chan retreats were after that. So about a year, within the year after I got back from India and responded well to medication, and I was okay. I started going to those Chan retreats. Looking back on it now that you raised that point, one of the reasons I physically died at those retreats so much might have been the condition I was in after being so sick.
At this point, did you consider yourself a Buddhist? Did you even think about it in those terms?
Yeah, I took refuge in Bodh Gaya, and from that moment on, refuge in the Bodhisattva vows.
So literally, you took refuge.
Yeah. So from that moment, I considered myself a Buddhist.
Was that a Theravada or a Mahayana monk?
I took refuge in the 5 lay precepts under Anagarika Munindra, but we had to. It was kind of like, you're living in the monastery now, you have to take these temporarily while you're here. They're not binding, you can give them up when you leave. So okay, we'll just do it. But then later, some months later, Chokin Nyima Rinpoche, a Tibetan master, offered to do refuge and the Bodhisattva vows under the Bodhi tree. And I took that very seriously. In fact, I agonized over each of the precepts and each of the Bodhisattva vows. Can I really do these or not? And in the end, I just jumped in and did it, but with a feeling that I'm committing to it now.
This might be a little bit of a tangent, but how was the 5th precept presented to you in that context? Was it to not drink at all? Was it was it explicit?
It was presented to me in that context, and again, it can be presented many different ways, as you well know. It was presented to me as non-intoxication, not getting intoxicated, and also that we were lay people. We were taking the precepts as lay people. We were not monks. So the main thing was to look at the function of the precepts in terms of clarity and how they protect your training. That's how it was presented. And I think that's very close to the Zen way of viewing the precepts too.
So did you start the Aikido prior to graduating, or is that something you did after you graduated?
I started that probably my freshman year in school, but just as something interesting,
I meant the serious, like wanting to heal yourself.
Yeah, that's when I took it seriously. So when I ended up after I graduated and I was healing myself, And I was also still determined to follow a Buddhist path in some committed manner. Toda Sensei, Toyoda Rokoji, invited me to his training hall to live there. And while I was there, I was doing Zen training, but also intensively doing martial arts training.
This was Chicago, the city of Chicago. How did you meet him?
So when I had first started doing martial arts earlier, as my freshman year, before going to India, before all of that, just as a hobby or something interesting, he was the head of the Aikido organization that my local dojo belonged to. So I got to meet him at seminars. I was struck by him. There was something about him. But then after I graduated from school, I went again to a training seminar with him. He had come to the East Coast. And he grabbed me immediately. I think he had known where I had been and what I had been through. He knew I was trying to get healthy again and so on. But basically, he grabbed me and he said, "What are you doing now? You graduated. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I want to study Buddhism. I want to practice. I also enjoy martial arts. I'd like to do both." He said, "Come to Chicago." So he threw the net over me. And
It's like fresh meat.
Pretty much, yeah. 3 or 4 months later, I was there. But again, even before I went there, I knew that there was something about him. There was an affinity with him. There was a connection with him that I hadn't felt with the other teachers. So there was no question in my mind I would go that direction.
How do I ask this? So in Aikido, I forget the name of the term, but where you're an apprentice and you live in the dojo and you're kind of the servant, was that the program you were involved with? What is that called?
There's several names for it. You can call it uchideshi, which means the inside student.
Yeah.
You can call it otomo, which means the attendant to the master, what we would call in Zen like the inji. That was my role. So I lived in the training hall for a total of 7 years. The first 3 years were in one block. And then I moved out. Then I moved back in a few times. But during that time also, I began to work for him or with him. He had international organizations promoting Japanese culture and teaching martial arts internationally. And I became his main assistant. So I got to, my first international travel other than India was to go around Europe teaching Aikido with him as his assistant. And that was amazing. And that also turned into Zen events. Amazing guy. Place that he established in Chicago, I don't think there was any other place like it in the States at the time, where it was actually a branch temple of a Rinzai Zen headquarters temple, and he had Zen training going on there, second floor. First floor, martial arts training, language classes, tea ceremony, flower arrangement. What an amazing place to land in, having just graduated from school. And he opened up all the doors for me, which led to where we are now. In fact, Korinji, the place we founded here, was his idea. It was his dream to found a true Rinzai Zen training monastery, not in a city, not a Zen center, but out in a rural area where we can do the traditional monastic training. That was his idea, his dream. He unfortunately died young, younger than me, but we're still riding his energy, still carrying on his intentions.
Did he have inka yet when you met him? Was he a fully transmitted teacher?
Not when I met him, but some short time afterwards, not long afterward. Yeah. But again, as a layperson, he was not interested to express himself as a Roshi, or he was not a priest. So, he said he liked beer and fish too much. He didn't want to live as a priest. He wanted to be a martial arts guy. His motto was more someone like Yamoka Teshu, famous sword master and Zen master, but moving in different parts of society and not bound up by robes and monastic rules and so on. That was here.
And so you guys had daily zazen at the least?
Yeah.
And was there Teisho and Doku? Do you guys call it Dokusan?
So because he was not a ordained master and didn't want to take that role, he would bring in Hosokawa Dogen Roshi. Hosokawa Roshi is.
Could you say it slower? I'm sorry.
Hosokawa Roshi. Hosokawa. First name Dogen. He's the main dharma heir of Omori Sogen. And he had moved to Hawaii, eventually became the abbot of a temple there called Chozenji, which was the main bridge for Omori Roshi's lineage to the west. So Toda Sensei invited him out a number of times a year to do sesshin in Chicago. So we had sesshin there, and my Sanzen, my Koan practice was actually under Hosokawa Roshi.
Okay.
For the most part, yeah. And then later under one of his heirs, So'zan Roshi.
Hmm. And did you, so what was your early formal Zazen practice? Was it breath work? Was it?
Oh yeah, we did Susokokan, the breath counting practice. That's commonly, as you probably know, given as the preliminary or foundational practice before one does koan work. I did
Mhm.
that for a few years. In fact, I was doing that even in the Chan retreats with Master Shen Yun, so I had some experience with that.
And what the Aikido you were learning, was that taught from an energetic perspective, or was it purely physical? What were you already working on those energetic levels?
We had
That
those kind of practices, breathing practices, internal energetic cultivation, and so on. But as we have in Rinzai Zen. But Toda Sensei, if you were to ask him that question, he would say, "What's the difference? This is energy." He was constantly critical of people who focused on so-called ki or energy as a conceptual idea and had an idea of some kind of a martial art using just a mysterious ki power. He said, "This is my ki is right here.
Mhm.
All of this is energy. How do you unify mind and body? How do you unify with the so-called opponent or partner? How do you express your whole existence as energy through the forms of the martial art?"
Mhm.
That was the way he would talk. He wasn't someone who would get much into sort of esoteric ki or energy talk.
Mhm.
That being said, his ki, his energetic vibration, his atmosphere, the intensity coming off that person was extreme.
Mhm.
And he was the kind of person you would sit in the same room with him and go into samadhi naturally, just from the power of his presence. So there was no doubt he had that mastery. But his way of talking about it, I think he felt that especially Aikido people, martial arts people, tend to think of energy as a kind of a mysterious magical substance that flows through your body. That was not his approach at all. He wanted you to use your flesh and your bones and to manifest your natural energy through the forms of the art. Very practical guy, very vigorous martial artist, very strong emphasis on effective, powerful technique.
Mhm.
Amazing guy, interesting guy.
Did you guys spar?
Yeah, in Aikido we have a practice called Randori,
Mhm.
which is basically free,
Mhm.
no form to it. And we do that practice even up to including having 6 people attacking you simultaneously.
I took a few Aikido classes, and it was, there's, as you well know, there's different flavors of Aikido. And I remember I asked um, the teacher if they sparred, and he looked at me as if I asked if I could eat his daughter, his baby. I mean, just it was just like he was like, "Are you crazy? Of course we don't spar." Like
Yeah,
it was. I find it interesting how there's so. I mean, maybe the same as Zen. There's just so many different types of Aikido under that word that almost have nothing to do with each other. You know.
I like to compare it to Tai Chi actually. Tai Chi is a incredibly refined and effective martial art if one studies it as such. It also can be studied for just simply for health, as healthy movement and so on. There could be many intentions behind it, and depending on that, that might determine how it's taught and how it's practiced. Aikido is very much the same. But if where was Toda Sensei on that spectrum, he was on the far right side, I might say, of the Aikido is a Budo. Aikido is a martial art.
Mhm.
Aikido has to have effective technique, and within that context of life or death encounter, that's
Mhm.
where the spiritual value is found. Not by pretending or going through the motions, but really exploring that space of any moment I might die. That's the power of martial arts training combined with Zen training from his standpoint. And I agree.
Did so did you so what was your rank in Aikido? Did you become a black belt, an instructor?
Yeah, yeah. My current rank is Rokudan, or 6th degree black belt, and I have the instructional title from the world headquarters of Shihan. But when Toda Sensei was alive, the highest rank by that time he had promoted me to Godan, 5th degree black belt. So, yeah, which means a whole lot of nothing. The ability is what's important, as you well know, not the certificate. But his training program was pretty intense. And when I think of what we went through, the kind of practice we did with each other back then, a lot of us, a bunch of 20 and early 30-something-year-old people just really going for it. balls to the wall, inspired by this amazing, energetic teacher. I feel proud. I feel proud of what we did.
So
Amazing.
that was your life for about 7 years, it sounds like.
About 10 years, actually. I was in Chicago while he was alive, 10, almost 11 years before he passed away. And then after that, the Zen group and the martial arts group, we left from that training hall that he had owned, and we reestablished ourselves on Chicago's north side, and it still exists today, but I have no hand in running those things now. I'm fully focused on Koan.
So did you live in the dojo all through that period, or at some point did you get an apartment?
7 of those 10 or 11 years, yes, I lived in the dojo.
So I mean, in a lot of ways, you were having a monastic style life.
It was monastic, including jumping over at the wall at night and going out and eating sushi and drinking beer. Absolutely. But the thing about it, which to me was most amazing, monastic or not monastic, because I was a layperson at that time, I was not ordained. But the training was certainly very rigorous as anything monastic. But he was there. He was there all day, every day. So of those 10, 11 years I spent with him, I would say the majority of it wasn't even in the training hall. It was sitting in the office across from him and talking about life and running the organizations and planning events and just being in his presence. It was like having 8 hours to 10 hours a day of sanzen, of dokusan, because he was on you, sharp with you about everything from your breathing to your way of sitting to how can you type that way, think about how you're using your body, and how can you talk that way? You have no intensity. Let me say it this way. When I moved into his training hall, I said, well, what's the training here like? What should I expect? He said, you will do Aikido, Buddha, you will do Zen. And then there's a third thing you will do called instructions for personal development. That was the catch-all phrase for any way that he wanted to get into you and transform you.
Why are you tying your shoes that way?
What's that? Well, exactly. Why are you carrying something that way? How can you walk that way? What position do you sleep in? The minutia of every movement through space, every word that comes out of one's mouth, revealing the functioning of one's mind. That was how he lived, training himself. And that was the kind of training that I experienced under him. And it wasn't just form. It was what is the essence of mind-body functioning underneath all the forms of Zen, of martial arts. I don't know if I could have gotten that training anywhere else. It was just him. It was what he was doing, and I was fortunate enough to be there for it.
Well, obviously you were receptive to it, and and there's a degree of humbling yourself. But I mean, did it piss you off?
Oh, absolutely. And we had fights. I've had things thrown at me, and he was a mercurial and a fiery person. But even that, looking back on it, I have no resentment. It was useful. I learned to be yelled at. I learned to yell. Something I never could have done before, to actually express myself forcefully. I had to learn to do that to survive there with him. So it was really a forging of my whole existence. It wasn't just sitting in Zazen, doing Koan practice, doing martial arts. I can't recognize the person I was before that training. I was useless. Essentially, I would have turned out to be a useless person if not for him.
Was as you were going through this phase of your life, did you see were you just taking it day by day? Did you see yourself working towards ordination? Did you see yourself working towards being a professional martial arts teacher, or both? Or did you just not think about it?
I mean, I love martial arts, and he pushed me to be a professional teacher. So I did that for some years, and I enjoyed some aspects of it, but it was not my dream. I told him quite early on that my dream was to be ordained. I wanted to do Zen training as deeply as I could. If it made sense to be a priest, I wanted to do that, maybe open a temple someday, something like that. He was not a fan of that idea. He wanted me to follow his model more as a lay teacher. Again, using someone like Yamoka Teshu more as the model rather than someone like Omori Roshi, who eventually became a priest. So he resisted it. At some point, he admitted that I would probably eventually do it, but I ended up not doing it until after he died. But from the very beginning, martial arts has been to me a supplement or a complement to Zen training. Whereas from his perspective, I think he saw himself as a Budoka, a martial artist who did Zen. I saw myself as a Zen practitioner who does martial arts. That was a little disconnect.
Fascinating. Did you take up Mu during this period, or was that after you moved on from that life, from that stage?
No, so that within the first year after I moved into the training hall, I started Sanzen with Hosokawa Roshi, and I started the first koan. Although my first koan was not Mu, it was Who am I? Question, who am I?
Mm-hmm. And you, how long did you stick with that?
2 years. 2 years, which is not a long time at all.
Yeah. And how long would you say it took you till it got to the point where it was 24/7, where you held that koan in your consciousness?
Well, I was lazy, but I was also lucky to be living in a training situation where everything was 24/7. You were never off. You were always on in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the last 6 months before I, so-called passed that koan, I was really trying to dig in. I was going out at night, going down to Lake Michigan, sitting on the rocks and doing zazen in front of the waves and just, who am I? Just really digging into it.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to have it be the last thing I would be working on before I fell asleep, the first thing I would pick up in the morning when I woke up, and so on. So it finally reached a point in that last 6 months, and then finally it came to about 2 weeks or a week, I guess 1 week before the sesshin. The next sesshin was about to happen. And I was digging into it so much that I guess I looked like a zombie. I was walking around wide-eyed. No matter what I was doing, I was trying to hold the question seamlessly without putting it down at all.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, it got to the point I couldn't really function. And Toda Sensei at that point saw me.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I was able to get the words out. "I'm holding my koan. Sesshin's coming. I'm holding my koan." And he just kind of scowled and he said, "What you're looking for is nothing special." And those words, that moment, when he said those words, something dropped completely. I suddenly felt so free and clear. The koan was still there, but the fixation, it was as if I had compressed, and then suddenly there was a release. It felt completely different. And then I went to bed that night working on the koan as usual. The next morning, the moment I woke up, suddenly the answer was there. So
Mm-hmm.
it was an interesting experience to me of how, what we would call a turning word, or the words of direct pointing, the right words at the right time, from someone with an energy, with the power like he had, and the discernment to see what was going on. His words were what shattered that state for me. And again, I wasn't the moment I had some awakening, but he created the conditions that I could then, the next morning, have the answer come out clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Strange karma I have with that guy,
And,
for sure.
Yeah. And so you're passed on that koan.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's kind of an informal koan. Were there checking questions or?
Oh no, those same checking questions in our shitsunai, in our koan system. Mu or who am I are considered the same koan, and you can use either one. So it's quite formal. It's been that way for a long time. Some people Mu fits and doesn't fit. I don't know why Hosokawa Roshi decided to give me who am I, but he did.
So a checking question from Mu might be, how much does Mu weigh? Like how would you phrase that to and maybe this is something you don't want to talk about publicly, but
yeah, we have a number of formal checking questions, not unlike that, and also the Mu koan has Mu koan, not who am I, has several parts. But later, when I was able to see the full shitsunai, we have the documents which contain all of our koan, so-called system. I could see that we use the same exact checking questions for who am I or Mu.
Interesting. And did you do Mu afterwards just to go through it, or was kind of informally, or did
No,
you
because the answer is the same.
Okay.
Experience is the same. There's no difference at all between them. So, if someone asked me what is a Mu, I could give the exact same answer. But because the experience is the same experience, no problem. I don't make people do both of them. I choose one or the other for the person, and that's the initial koan.
Yeah, are you guys Inzan koan lineage?
So the so-called Inzan, not so called. I have this habit of saying so called all the time. It's an affectation from Hosokawa Roshi, so I apologize. I don't always mean it when I say it. There's the Inzan and Takuju schools, but there are also sub-schools of Inzan. And also many Shitsunai, Koan curriculum, are not strictly one or the other because there are different historical things that happen which cause there to be some combination. So anyway, through some accidents of history, for example, one master trained in the Takuju style and then became the abbot of Tenryuji, where there was the Inzan style, and then after that there's a mixed style. Our curriculum is actually mostly Inzan, but has a little bit of Takuju, and then also has a little bit of some sub-schools called the Minoha and Bizan-ha. And it's kind of like Rinzai's nerd talk, right? But yeah, that's what it is.
You go through not a random order, but the order of your koans are not the same order as they are in the major koan collections. Is that correct?
I've been told in a straight Takuju style, that's what they do, right? Go through Mumonkan, starting with 1 and all the way up at the end. And no, we don't do that at all. We don't do that at all. There's certainly a structure in the curriculum, but it doesn't follow the texts.
How about in style? Is it sharp and short dokusan, or do you guys say dokusan or sanzen? What's your phraseology?
Well, sanzen is the general word for that practice of encountering the teacher, where koan training takes place. Dokusan is a type of sanzen.
Okay. Could you talk about what the difference is there?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so sanzen is that general practice. And I would call that the central practice of Rinzai Zen. It's the one indispensable practice, even more than zazen. Even if you're a person who doesn't need zazen, you have to do sanzen. So it's a practice of going for Zen to the teacher. Dokusan is a type of that going or interview, if you will. Doku means solitary or alone. It's optional. It's those times during, for example, sesshin or the monastery day where sanzen is offered and you can choose if you want to go or not. Then there's another type of sanzen called so'zan, and that's also something that happens during sesshin at some particular points. That's where it's mandatory. So means all, everyone. Everyone has to go. So the upshot of it is sanzen's the general term. Dokusan and so'zan refer more to specific forms that takes, whether it's optional or mandatory. All dokusan are sanzen, but not all sanzen are dokusan, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And so were your early sanzen experiences, was it intimidating for you?
Oh, yeah. I couldn't breathe. I was so scared of Hosokawa Roshi. He's not a scary guy. I mean, he has power, but he was not blustery or terrifying in his behavior. Very mild. Most often I would give some answer to a koan. He would just laugh and ring the bell and say no. But still, I was so scared to go in there. Couldn't breathe at all.
And can you talk a little bit about him? Was he a small guy, a big guy? Was he, on his day-to-day walking around? Was he jolly? Was he taciturn? Like, can you paint a little bit of a picture of what his personality was like?
He was smaller than me. I never saw him as small. He's very elegant looking. He's got very refined hands, for example. I mean, he's a master calligrapher. There's an artistic refinement to him that Toda Sensei didn't have. Toda Sensei was a big blustering guy, martial arts feeling. Hosokawa Roshi is more refined, but very intelligent, very kind. I mean, a compassionate, kind person, but sharp. When he would cut, when it was time to cut with sharpness, you were almost surprised by it, but it was so clean, so effective, without a lot of fieriness behind it, just almost surgical in feeling. That was my experience of him. But I, as a person, really great person. I eventually got to spend more personal time around him, even to go out to eat with him and just talk about stuff. He has a deep intellectual interest in many aspects of Zen training and very well read, fascinating guy.
And is he a product of the Soto experience? Did he?
Yeah. He was a Unsui at Tenryuji, one of the great Daihonzan in Kyoto, and he originally trained under Hirata Roshi, who was the abbot at that time. But during that time, he met Omori Roshi. It's an interesting story in itself, but and decided, I'm going to leave the Sodo and go train with Omori Roshi. And this caused all kinds of political problems at the time. But before that happened, he had a lot of trouble in the early years of his training. He didn't grow up as someone on the priest track. He originally went to school to become an engineer and only decided later to be a priest. So he had some catching up to do.
So he wasn't a temple son.
He was a temple son, but he decided he wasn't going to follow that.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah. And then I guess he got into the salaryman's world of being an engineer and decided this is not for me. I'm going to be a priest instead. And I guess kind of thought he was just kind of going to breeze through that training and learned pretty quickly how difficult it was. But by the time he finished, the time he was spending at Tenryuji, he was kind of renowned for the severity of his practice. And then he went to follow Omori Roshi. So
was Tenryuji, was that considered like a double soto? Were they pretty hardcore?
Well, I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's a sodo. I think all sodos are severe, and it's a very prestigious place because of its history, and it was the top of the Gozan system for centuries and so on. So it's not a place where they're slacking, that's for sure. There's an intense training going on there, and he certainly got fruit of that. But then I think his training with Omori Roshi was what opened his eyes to many other more profound aspects of our practice.
And would those be the energetic?
I guess so. I guess so. Again, because Omori Roshi had this emphasis not just on traditional Zen training, but also the physical expression through things like martial arts, the artistic expression through things like calligraphy or painting. Always looking at things in terms of kiai, energy. What's the energetic vitality, vibration of something? How do we master kiai, energy, kokyu, timing, ma'ai, space? And we view our training as a mastery of those things rather than empty forms. Omori Roshi, I didn't meet him, but of course, incredibly energetic, intense person also. I guess Hosokawa Roshi was someone who could benefit from that.
Did Omori Roshi, did he live in a temple, or is it more of a more of a dojo, or like what actually was that situation?
So he became ordained relatively late in life, in his 40s, at the end of World War II. So from that time onward, he was already married and had children, but from that time onward, he was living as a priest, temple life, either in a sodo or in temples which he started or which he took care of. So some of those temples are still in Tokyo, smaller places. Not all of them are sodo, but they were places where he was training disciples and so on. Yeah, he lived as a priest basically to the end of his life, as far as I know. But he was also president of Hanazono University, the Rinzai University. He served as advisor to the All Japan Kendo Federation. He had a lot of social engagement and wide circles of interesting people. So it wasn't as if he was a hermit, ensconced someplace. He was very active.
So after studying with Omori Roshi, what brought your teacher to the United States? Or he went to Hawaii, is that correct?
Oh, I'm sorry, what's that?
After studying with Omori Roshi, he went to Hawaii, is that correct?
Hosokawa Roshi, yeah. So another one of Omori Roshi's students, Tanoi Roshi, who was a Japanese American from Hawaii, was going to Japan constantly to train in martial arts and eventually also in Zen. He became a dharma heir of Omori Roshi and founded or helped to found a temple in Hawaii called Chozenji. Omori Roshi at some point, or Hosokawa Roshi at some point, while Omori Roshi was still alive, was basically sent there to help out with that, to help basically the idea being to transmit Shugyo, to transmit this lineage's approach to the West. They saw Hawaii as a bridge to do that, as a good place to be able to plant those seeds. And they were right. That temple became the way that stuff moved into the mainland. And Toda Sensei's place in Chicago was a branch of Chozenji in Hawaii. That became the center of the activity in the mainland. So,
was Chozenji, was it an official soto, or is it more of a branch temple?
It's a temple. It's a temple. It wasn't a branch of any place. That's the thing. Okay. Omori Roshi established it as an independent headquarters temple. They never did build a so-called sodo. They have the capacity and have had some live-in students there, but I think I've not seen that they have ever expressed themselves as a true sodo. But they certainly were doing an intense kind of training there, and people who could endure that and who were interested to live there full time to do it had the opportunity to do so. Still do, as I understand.
So it's a functioning temple to this day.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. Dharma heirs of Tonoi Roshi are still there.
Mhm. So for you personally, can you talk about your transition from, Aikido instructor, living with your first teacher, to getting ordained? What was the transition there? How did that happen?
No transition because I was still spending all of my day in a training hall anyway.
Mhm.
But what I had to learn, and it took me a while, was that being ordained, of course, brings with it a whole other set of duties and things one has to study and learn. There's this obligation to do a certain kind of training for one's whole life. There's an obligation to study the texts and to learn ceremonial functions to minister to the people and so on. But there's also the obligation to present a certain face or image or dignity
Mhm.
as someone who is the face of the tradition. And I didn't take to that well at all. Toda Sensei didn't want me to be a priest because he said, you're not free as a priest. It's like, no, it's fine. I so want to be a priest. I'll just be a priest. Hosokawa Roshi, too, warned me. Being a priest can be like being a prison. Maybe you shouldn't do it. Anyway, I was stubborn. Eventually, I did it anyway.
Mhm.
They were right. And I chafed against it for a long time. What do you mean I can't, just date whoever I want or go out and do whatever I want? There's an old saying or old phrase, the burden of the robe.
Mhm.
And Hosokawa Roshi explained it this way one time. Maybe Omori Roshi originally said it. In old Japan, if you have to go to the bathroom, you can just go on the side of the road and squat. If you're a priest, you can't just lift up your koromo and
Mhm.
take a piss. You have a certain image. You can't do what normal people do.
Mhm.
That's the burden of the robe. And I guess I'm still understanding what that is and trying to do my best to
Mhm.
to do it justice and not to embarrass the tradition through my somewhat wild nature.
Did you do Jukai prior to ordination?
I had already done it in India, as I mentioned. So
Okay.
no, I didn't. There was no need to. But
Mhm.
if I hadn't done it, then I would have requested it first. And
Mhm.
typically we do. People do Jukai first.
So you did you guys call it Shukai Tokido? Am I saying it right?
Well,
Shukai.
there's two kinds of tokudo.
Yeah.
There's shuke tokudo. Shuke means leaving home.
Mhm.
That's what we call priest ordination.
Mhm.
Then there's zaike tokudo. Zaike literally means staying at home.
Mhm.
That's what we have the slang term jukai for.
Mhm.
So they're both actually a type of tokudo, but one is lay, one is not lay.
Right. So when you went through the ceremony, where did you live at that point?
When I got ordained,
Mhm.
by that time Toda Sensei had died. That was
Mhm.
1990. Oh, excuse me, 2005, I think.
Mhm.
I don't remember. 2003, 2005. I'm not sure. At that time, I was no longer living in the training hall, but I was full-time running a training hall in Chicago, the one that was the successor to Toyoda Sensei's place, where we were doing Zen and doing martial arts. So I was basically there all day. I just wasn't living there. I had an apartment nearby.
Mhm. And did you guys have a service in the morning? Like what what how monastic was the schedule? Was there like up at
Oh, that
4 a.m.
at that
service?
at the place when I got ordained, no, not at all. It was more like what you would. I guess the analog would be like a neighborhood temple. So there were certain times during the week when people could come in. Every Sunday morning there was a choka. Sanzen or Doksan was offered several times a week for people who were doing that formal training. But it wasn't a monastic full-time place at all. And we were doing Aikido probably, or martial arts training probably 5, 6 times a week too. Other cultural activities, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, all kinds of stuff going on.
Could you talk a little bit about what the experience of koans were like after your initial opening? Did you Was it a smooth transition for you? Did you find it? I don't know if I'm articulating this well. I mean, what was that an easy switch for you to kind of switch gears?
I didn't see it as a switching of gears. My initial opening, I would not say, was terribly deep.
Mhm.
Um, I had an experience much later, which was much more profound and caused me to understand some things about koan practice that I hadn't grasped. But I struggled with koan practice. I think, like many people, I tend to be a little analytical,
Mhm.
and I had trouble with that aspect of it. So I was confused, and Hosokawa Roshi was not someone. He was not someone who would give you anything easily. I mean, you had to really show some penetration of the koan's essential point to get anything from him. So 99% of my koan training memory is him ringing the bell, laughing, and saying no, and going back frustrated. I think it was some years later, over time, slowly, you start to figure out what this method is, how to kufu, we say, how to grapple creatively with the koan. It took me a long time to learn that, how to do it with the body and how to just really go into the situation of the koan. Eventually, yeah, something starts to cook or hum. It's almost like the koan machine starts to function, and you find, oh, I can see through this one, or this one I don't quite have, but I understand what it's pointing at. But I'm talking about 15 years after my training started, the koan training, that I got to that point.
Yeah. So regarding, your initial opening not being that deep, as you said, seems like there's different philosophies that different teachers take with, passing someone from the initial koan, and it may be the same teacher approaches different students different ways. One is maybe the most, you could say, liberal, is there just needs to be some sense of maybe absolute reality, as they would term it, and then you can go on with the koans. Maybe a more moderate stance is there needs to be a clear kensho, like unambiguous, clear understanding of what you are, who you are, before you can move on. And then maybe the most conservative approach is, there has to be like a clear, final resolution, and then you can go on with the koans. And it sounds like your teacher was maybe more of the moderate, kind of the middle of the road in that stance.
No, I don't think so. I don't know what a lot of Zen teachers are doing today, to be honest. But the traditional Rinzai Zen approach is we recognize that kensho can be of various depths, but for it to be genuine kensho, I should say, if it's genuine kensho, that's clear. Even if it's not of great depth, it has to be genuine kensho to be passed on that initial koan. Because otherwise, the post-awakening, the post-kensho practice takes kensho itself as its basis. So there's no way that anyone could do that practice unless they had something genuine to begin with. Even if it's shallow, it could be sufficient, because we can deepen that, we can refine it. And the koans which come after will point to it again and again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be genuine. There's definitely a line, genuine or not genuine, not necessarily tied to depth. Okay? But also in the traditional understanding, we differentiate very clearly between kensho and a more profound awakening, which is a kind of resolution, what we would call daigo or daigo tete. And that is something that you may have much later. It's possible for someone to have that right at the beginning. It's not common. There are people who have, but I would say it's rare. It's more common for someone to have, shallow or deep, maybe not so deep, but at least genuine awakening, the recognition, the arising of that knowledge that we call kensho. And then based on that, we can continue to remove obstructions. We can integrate that experience, deepen it, embody it, and ultimately arrive at the more profound, more final awakening. That's the way the system has always been set up. I mean, that's the kind of Rinzai Zen 101. But I do think, the question leads me to, I do think there is a big problem in Zen in general in the West of giving students the koan too soon. If the clear samadhi condition, the capacity to hold the koan seamlessly, has not yet manifested, it's pretty useless to give someone a koan, and you may just cause them more problems. That's one. Two, it's a big problem to pass someone too soon. Someone should not be passed because they are in a samadhi condition. That can be transformative and appear as transformation, but it's not awakening. Someone who may have a profound experiential sense of I am the universe, that's not kensho, it's just samadhi. They should not be passed on the koan. If the teacher doesn't have the clear eye and experience to know what genuine kensho is, shallow or deep, then we have a big problem. I cannot say what's going on everywhere, but I have to say that kensho or not is a clear point. And whether the kensho is shallow or deep has to be clear to the teacher if it's actually kensho or if it's just one of the many phenomena, samadhi states and so on that we always experience in meditation, which can seem quite liberating and quite transforming. but aren't Kensho at all. Is that frank enough? I was told the other day on another podcast that I'm very frank.
That was great. So you're so I listened to your interview that you did with the a Viking guru. Is that
Guru Viking? Yeah,
Guru Viking?
this guy.
Yeah, and you talked about the opening you had in, was it Seattle?
Mm-hmm.
What teacher?
So that's interesting. I was doing a sesshin with Genjo Marinello Roshi,
Okay.
a great guy, an amazing teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I went out there for that was because Toda Sensei had died,
Mm-hmm.
and I still had Hosokawa Roshi was still my main Zen teacher at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But Chiba Sensei, another great Aikido master who's now also passed away, but he was based in San Diego. I had decided I was going to bring my Aikido group under his umbrella, and he said, "Oh, you're a Zen guy. I am too. I want to meet you. Come to Rohatsu Sesshin in Seattle." So my condition to join his Aikido organization was to sit Rohatsu Sesshin across from Chiba Sensei and being led by Genjo, who I love dearly. What was amazing about that sesshin to me, leaving aside the experience I had there, was that it was the first sesshin I had had since 1990 that, so say, I don't know, 12 years, something like that. First sesshin I had had or been to, I had no role, no job, no one knew who or cared who I was. I was just another person sitting there and could focus only on my practice. That combined with the fact that Chiba Sensei, who was an immensely powerful individual, was sitting right across from me, I believe made the conditions for me to have a profound experience there.
Were you doing Dokusan at that sesshin, or were you just sitting?
Oh no, I went into Dokusan every time just to connect with Genjo,
Mm-hmm.
and he knew I had another teacher, so he wasn't taking responsibility for me. But we had some things we would talk about and work on. There was a one.
You weren't presenting an understanding to a koan to him or anything like that.
Oh yeah, actually he said, "Well, have you done this koan?" It was a particular koan. I said, "No, I haven't done that one yet." I said, "Oh, well, why don't you work on that one while you're here?" So we did that, and that was nice. But the experience I had, the opening experience I had, there wasn't tied to the koan, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how would you compare and contrast that opening to your previous one that allowed you to pass your initial koan?
The initial experience made clear to me what Zen training is pointing at, and also clarified to me what the path of unifying prajna and samadhi, or the wisdom or the recognition we have with Kensho in unity with samadhi, as you know, that's what the sixth patriarch said, the true Zen samadhi is. So that experience of that breakthrough, and then also going through the checking questions afterward, revealed that to me clearly. But again, I would not say it was in a profound way, in that I was still had so much habitual delusive tendency. Of course, I still do, but I cannot say it deeply transformed me, but it made clear the path to me. It was sufficient basis to go forward on. Okay, so, for better or worse, Hosokawa Roshi passed me. The experience I had later was even more so. First one was this way too, but even more so in the classic model that Hakuin talks about, of entering the particular samadhi where the entire world turns white and you feel as if you're frozen in an ice sheet 10,000 miles thick. And then at that moment, if you redouble your efforts, you enter the great death, the samadhi of the great death, where all time and space drop away. Even consciousness seems to drop away. You don't know how long you're in that state. Basically, you die.
Mm-hmm.
And then something spontaneously can happen to shatter that samadhi, and we arrive at the breakthrough. I had that experience in that sesshin, sitting one afternoon. And I don't know how long I was in that profound state that Hakuin talks about. But what shattered it for me was the sound of one of the waves breaking in Puget Sound. And when I came up out of that, I knew everything was different irrevocably.
Mm-hmm.
And Genjo, because he has a clear eye, I went into him. I didn't really have anything to say, and I just said, something happened. And he knew. He could see. And right after that, I mean, that changed the direction of my training incredibly. Not the direction, but the penetration of it. And everything was different after that. So I count that as a more profound awakening.
Mhm.
That being said, I made the classic mistake at that moment during that session. I was so happy about it, and everything was so different that I let up my efforts and I started to coast for the last few days of the session. If I had kept pushing, I might have been able to deepen it even more. I really lost that opportunity, but that was my fault, just my laziness.
Mhm. I mean, as far as Buddha's the reason Buddha's great doubt was, we get sick, we get old, we die. This really sucks. I'm afraid of it. And his awakening resolved those questions for him. Would you say that awakening resolved those questions for you?
Yeah, I would say that question disappeared. I don't have that profound question anymore. I don't have a great doubt in that way. I have small doubt now. Doubt in
Mhm.
myself, fear of this situation, Underneath it, there's an overriding doubtlessness or even fearlessness.
Mhm.
Am I afraid to die? In the actual moment of having to die, maybe I will feel great fear, but I don't have that overriding existential
Mhm.
terror at all. Somehow the roots of that were cut.
Mhm.
But now, how to again continue to deepen that experience and function from it, and to cut even all of the small doubts, even in the small situations which may not be so important and pressing. How can I function from that realization and be of benefit to others, and cut through still the habitual aversions and desires and attachments that I have, and so on. This lifetime's work is continuing, but I'm grateful. I'm actually grateful the way things turned out for me. And there are many small experiences in between all of this too. But that initial experience, which I could discern from that, as I said, what's a genuine kensho, even if it's not so deep, and what does it mean? Post kensho practice, what does it mean? It's grateful for that, and then later to have the deeper experience, which pointed to me the endlessness of the path and how much further I have to go.
Mhm.
So amazing that it worked out that way for me. If I had had that profound experience in the beginning when I was younger, that might have been a disaster. Actually, it might not have been something I was ready to process or work with.
Yeah. So in classical, if you read the early Buddhist text, the Theravada Pali Sutras, they state fairly categorically that a Buddha, one who's fully awakened, has completely extinguished the fetters and the three poisons. I've been practicing Zen for 30 years now, and I took pretty significant break when I had my kids, but you never stop practicing. But I stopped sitting daily, and I've practiced with a lot of different teachers. I've visited, I've sat sashing at many different places. Got to know a few teachers pretty well. I've never met anybody that I would consider who has kind of met the criteria of Theravada's belief of a completely awake person. Everyone I've met has had they clearly seemed they clearly seem they still have some issues with the three poisons, definitely some fetters. And I wonder, maybe this is not a fair question. Like, I mean, do you think full Buddhahood as defined by Theravada um, sutras is that? Do you think that's a real thing? Have you met anyone you feel has accomplished that, or do you see it as more as like this a wonderful motivation to practice? And what's your opinion of what is awakening, and what does it relate to the scriptural the full scriptural definition of awakening?
Well, from the Theravada standpoint, also, the goal isn't to become Buddha. The goal is to become an Arhat. And
Hmm.
he was the one Buddha of this world system
Hmm.
and age and time, right? But we could attain complete liberation. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's from the Theravada viewpoint, that's possible. I have met people that I would say were profoundly awakened, and I had no doubt had attained a kind of liberation that I have not. I would not say they were Buddha. I mean, even from a Mahayana standpoint, Buddhahood, if you, Bodhisattva Yana, the course of the six perfections, the paramitas, and so on, endless or uncounted aeons to complete that path.
Hmm.
Paths which jump out from that Theravada model or the sort of classic Mahayana model, like Zen, and Zen is not the only one, says that within one lifetime the profound or even the final accomplishment is possible.
Mhm.
Yeah, I believe in those too. I would say from the Zen standpoint, actually, what is most likely, what is most possible, and what is held out as the likely goal for someone who attains most deeply, is they will actually attain the full liberation, the final release, the final attainment of Buddhahood after death in the intermediate state, what we call chewing.
Mhm.
That's a Zen standpoint. But before we die, we can attain very profound
Mhm.
awakening and be mostly free from those fetters, or at least see that the causes of them are being exhausted, and we are able, again, at the moment of the dissolution of the body or the death of the body
Mhm.
and the entry into the intermediate state, that's the moment where there's a gap where we're actually able to have the final complete release that we were not able to do in this life. That's a Zen standpoint, okay? I know not all Buddhist traditions will agree with that. There are some that will. But to me, all I can do is my best. My bodhisattva vows continue forever. I'm
Mhm.
not in some kind of hurry to attain anything except in as much as it will help me to help others. So from
Mhm.
that standpoint, all I have to do is my best. That's all any of us can do. We don't have to set up a Buddhahood as a kind of possible attainment or goal. The question for me is, how do I practice today?
Mhm.
Is my practice progressing? Have I clearly had this experience we call awakening? Am I clearly practicing to embody that in accordance with that? Is there progression and continued deepening, increased profundity in my training or not?
Mhm.
Those are the questions I think practitioners need to concern themselves with mostly.
So I have two other questions kind of related to this topic. The next one would be, let's say somebody is a soldier and they go to war and they develop PTSD, and they have this deep, or maybe another person is abused as a child. In both cases, this person has a deep trauma that they have no control over, that rears its head against their will based on triggers. And let's say this person is a Zen practitioner and has the deep kind of maybe what we'd call the final awakening. Do you feel the awakening should erase that trauma, or do you think it's just on a totally different plane level? Like, are they?
I have no idea. I have no idea. We all have, okay, if you believe in the Buddhist teaching, we all
Mhm.
have endless stuff like that
Mhm.
already entwined within this body mind. And there's
Mhm.
no telling how or when it could come up. Okay?
Mhm.
But the profound awakening cuts at the root of that stuff. It doesn't mean necessarily that the habitual patterns, what we call jike, the karmic traces, are not still there and functioning. And that's why we have to continue to practice and do our best. But if we can cut fully the root of the I fixation, the self-referential way of seeing, the false construct of me, I, where can that stuff stick? Doesn't mean you won't still have to creatively work with it, because there's still a body mind here where stuff's arising. But if we're talking about liberation, awakening, again, from the Buddhist standpoint, because all of that is predicated also on rebirth,
Mhm.
we can cut those patterns in the space of one life. We can cut them at the moment of death. We can at least have confidence that the next existence where we arise will continue along the path of deepening and self-perfection because of the force of our vows and because we took refuge and because of the awakening, the insight we had. So
Mhm.
again, if we want to look at things from the standpoint of just this lifetime and negating the original teaching of rebirth, I don't have much to say because that's not the view that I have. But if we can accept the actual Buddhist teaching, that
Mhm.
this body mind as it's manifesting now is already the product of endless stuff like that. As Buddha said, the tears you have cried during your time in samsara are greater than all the oceans in the world.
Mhm.
Okay, it's normal. Samsaric existence is not fun. We all have stuff. But how does the training help us to cut at the core of what causes this endless cycling through the cesspool of lives?
Mhm.
I don't think necessarily it's always useful to feel that one is bound by or to focus on the branches, the individual manifestations of our suffering, the stuff we've experienced, our trauma, all of which is genuine and true and to be worked with in the practice. But we're not talking about just the next 10 years. We're talking about up to the very moment of your death. And what then? And then what then? And then what then? That's the Buddhist training project is concerned with that endless future existence. So from that standpoint, also, we can take some comfort. It's not difficult to change our direction. So even something like the Bodhisattva vows will start to carry us in ways where we will not be so bound up with that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If not in this life, then in future lives. We take the long view, so to speak. And again, if we have that genuine experience that what I am, this being seemingly suffering all of this horrible stuff, is in fact not a being in the way that I think it is in fact boundless and not limited in any way by those things.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time that in my day-to-day life, I have to work with them. That is a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful perspective. And to have that faith, to have that encouragement, to have the joyfulness of those moments where you realize, oh, I'm not so bound by this stuff as I thought I was. To me, that's what practice can give us. And all I will say to people is, whatever your conditions, your trauma, whatever you've experienced, however horrible it may be, here's a practice. It will help. Set your intention, set your bodhisattva aspiration, take the vows, set your aspiration to encompass others besides yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't help but improve this life, future lives, however many it takes, but our vows continue forever. That goes for all of us.
Thank you. So my third question on this kind of topic is, so, part of the history of Zen's transmission to America has involved a lot of scandals. In many cases, and I think I've heard you say something similar, the teachers weren't always what they were kind of presented to be. Their credentials were incomplete. Their training was incomplete. They were held up to be, deeply realized people when really they were kind of not ready to be teachers. So some of the problems were of that nature, but still, I think there's plenty of evidence that awakening does not make you a morally infallible person. So what do you think the relationship is between ethics, morality, and awakening? What are the interplays? How do you practice there, and so forth?
I wouldn't use the words ethics or morality. I think they're too loaded. But I would just say precepts, because precepts are how these things manifest in our practice. The purpose of the precepts is to protect your practice so it doesn't go off the rails. It's to protect you from harming yourself or others. It's to enable your practice to continue on the right direction and deepen. So in that sense, precepts are extremely important. And again, precepts are not divinely given rules.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, from the Zen standpoint, our way of using the precepts, because every Buddhist school has its own way of viewing and using them. But from the Zen standpoint, they're impossible to keep. You're breaking all of them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the precept against intoxicants or intoxication. From the Zen standpoint, and we penetrate this in Rinzai Koan practice too, the real intoxicant is ignorance. And any moment that you give rise to self-referential seeing or dualistic seeing or habitual ignorance, you completely break that precept. You've broken it. As surely as if you went out and got drunk and, did something unskillful.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about those things, we have to, I think, have a lot of compassion for each other, and we have to look at them from the standpoint of we are all breaking these all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do we use them to protect the practice? Certainly, as you said, if we have someone who's set up as a teacher who shouldn't be in that role, who didn't do sufficient training, that's a problem. I can also say, when I started teaching, I was not ready to teach. I probably shouldn't have been in that role. I have to be honest. And that may be the case for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But I cannot look at it from the standpoint of, here's rules. If someone breaks a rule, they should be removed. Or Buddhism has a strict morality. If you break this morality, it means you're not awakened. A lot of activities that we also tend to get all excited about when we read the old Zen records, the wild actions of Zen masters, so-called crazy wisdom, as some of the Tibetan Buddhist folks say. If someone did that today, there would be clamoring calls for them to step down as teachers. So a lot of this is also our own projection. We have to look at our own disordered relationship with things like sexuality, for example, in the modern world. And we have to take all of that together and just return to the pragmatics of how do I keep the training on course? And how do I use it to express compassionate regard, my bodhisattva vows towards others, rather than selfishness, trying to get something from others, and so on. If we take that viewpoint as a teacher or a student, because there's no difference at all,
Mhm.
then we'll still break the precepts, we'll still make mistakes, but I think we won't go so far off the rails.
Mhm. So would it be your guess EQ would not be a popular teacher?
Oh, EQ, what? EQ would be, yeah, well, we know what would happen with EQ. Absolutely, absolutely. And yet we value his humanity
Mhm.
and his accessibility, and some of the same people who would condemn that sort of behavior love EQ's poetry and his talking about love and so on. So uh, yeah, I don't want to judge people. I am not hesitant to judge based on broken lineage or incomplete lineage transmission, or someone who is fraudulent in their claims of being a teacher, or who didn't complete the training that we would normally expect a teacher to complete, and so on. I have no problem to call that stuff out. But when it comes to so-called morality or ethics, uh, you know, going back to my Christian roots, I don't want to cast the first stone because I see my own delusion, my own mistakes so clearly, and I'm dependent upon the compassion of others to tolerate that constantly. So
Mhm.
I hate to judge, especially incidents that I have no first person knowledge of. We do love to gossip. That's another thing.
So to get back to kind of the narrative of your, thank you for that. To get back to the narrative of your path. So you, at some point, you finish your Koan studies, and you switch teachers have to finish your Koan curriculum.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
correct?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Could you talk a
So
little bit about that?
absolutely. So most of my years of doing Sanzan were under Hosokawa Roshi, as I mentioned. And Hosokawa Roshi reached the point where he was going to retire. And he had already, by that point, named some dharma heirs, one of whom was my dharma brother, So'zan Roshi, So'zan Miller. We trained together for many years. He received inka and started to do Sanzen for his own students. So I
Mhm.
asked Hosokawa Roshi, how should I continue with my training now that you're retiring? He said, please work with So'zan Roshi.
Mhm.
So I did so. And
Mhm.
I did that for, I think, 3 or 4 years, which is what it took for me to finish up the last part of my Koan practice. But that was an amazingly eye-opening experience for a number of reasons. One is that he has always been a close friend, like a brother to me, certainly a training brother, and also in a personal sense, a great deal of respect for him.
Mhm.
So we already knew that there was an affinity. Now, could we navigate the change to a teacher-student relationship and still preserve the other relationship, or how would that work? I had
Mhm.
questions about that. Turned out it was pretty painless, and that
Mhm.
speaks to his integrity and how clean he can be in his relationships.
Mhm.
But the other thing that was amazing was he was the first person I did Sanzen with that was a native English speaker. So we could talk about fine points of stuff, or he could catch the subtext of what I was saying in ways that maybe Hosokawa Roshi or even Toda Sensei could not.
Mhm.
So that was a really good experience for me to do a certain amount of koan practice with someone who spoke my language, and that helped to, I guess, give me a sense of how I would do it in the future with my own students here.
Is he still an active teacher? Is he
Oh
still
yeah,
alive?
yeah. He's the abbot of Daiyozenji, the temple in Chicago,
Mhm.
which is now a fully independent temple, and he guides the training there.
And is that a residential practice center or?
No, it hasn't been since Toda Sensei's center, since the training was no longer being done there, since Toda Sensei's death. The place in Daiyozenji was the one I was mentioning earlier, where there isn't necessarily Okyo and stuff every morning. It's more like a neighborhood Zen center, but they have sitting number of times a week that people can go to. They're doing choka, they're doing zazenkai, sesshin, that kind of stuff. But not what we would call a residential center.
So eventually you finished the Koan curriculum, and your teacher and he presented you inka. Is that correct?
That's right.
So I know how it works in Soto, but in Rinzai, is that a public ceremony or is that a private ceremony? How does that work?
So apparently some groups have a public ceremony. We didn't.
Hmm.
He announced it during Sesshin.
Hmm.
One night after Teisho, he announced it publicly. So that was our public ceremony at a Sesshin.
Hmm.
And of course, we have the traditional documents and all of that. But I know some places have a public dharma transmission ceremony and so on. Wasn't our custom to do that.
In Soto Zen, there's actually robe color changes and all that kind of stuff. Do they have that in Rinzai? Is there?
Teachers may or tend to sometimes wear brown robes, brown koromo.
Mhm.
It's not mandatory. You can wear whatever you like.
Mhm.
But if you see someone wearing a brown rather than the classic black koromo, it should imply that that is someone certified as a teacher.
Same thing with the rakusu.
Not necessarily.
Mhm.
If someone is a unsui, a novice trainee in a sodo, generally everything's black, right? If someone finishes their unsui time, their time in the sodo, and they receive the certification we call jushoku, which means that they're now qualified to run a temple someplace. They don't have inka, they're not a teacher necessarily, but they can run a temple. They could wear different colors of rakusu. We have the kind of yellow gold rakusu, which is a very standard Rinzai thing. That doesn't mean someone's a teacher necessarily.
That's just something formal for ceremonies at your
Yeah,
temple.
exactly, more formal. The unsui wear is very Spartan, dark color, black or indigo, everything. But after you pass out from that stage, you'll see more colorful stuff. But the koromo usually is black unless the person is a teacher.
And so you received inka. Did you immediately start teaching? Did you what was your transition from student to teacher?
I guess,
Were you an assistant teacher for him? I mean, how did that transition
yeah.
work for you?
Yeah, so the transition started a little earlier. So before my inka was actually announced, as a priest, I was already leading Zazen groups. I was already assisting at the temple Daiozenji there in Chicago.
Mhm.
And at some point, he gave me permission to start doing sanzen with people, even though my inka hadn't been announced. But I think in some sense it was part of my training to start to have that experience and work with people and understand what's involved with it. So it wasn't a hard line where today you're a student, okay, now go start doing sanzen with people. I had some sort of transition time where I could start to learn those forms. And of course, it's still attending sesshin and observing my teachers and so on to see how they're actually doing things now that I have that concern, teacher's concern.
And so what was your so you already had an independent group at that point?
Not independent, but I was running various branch groups throughout the Chicago area. Daiozenji was our headquarters. And then eventually I founded the Korinji Foundation, but Korinji, the temple, or the monastery, I should say, wasn't dedicated until 2014. And that was some 7 years after I got inka. So it was quite some time before I kind of had my own independent place, which is Korinji.
How did you survive? Were you teaching martial arts?
Yeah. I was still teaching martial arts. I was making a basic living from that.
Mm-hmm. And if this isn't too personal, were you married? Did you have kids?
I'm divorced. I have been married, but no kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so a little bit about Korinji. So you probably slowly developing a community around you. Did you guys have an angel that gave you the bulk of a down payment, or
no?
Or was it small donations? How did that work?
No, I'm still joking. I'm waiting for the rich Zen widow to bequeath to us or something like that. No, it was all grassroots. We announced some project in, I think, 2003. I was going to raise money to try to buy land to at least establish a hermitage, if not a small temple or something. By 2008, we had raised enough money to buy our land, but it was all grassroots. $25 here, $10 there. An event in Europe that brought in $1,000 from Aikido, so I would use that. And we cobbled it together. And so that was 2008. We bought the land. By 2017, and then we had no money at all. Then we were back down to zero. Started fundraising again grassroots, no big donations. I think the largest donation we ever had was 10 grand, and that happened once. The rest of them were $1,000 or less. By 2017, 2014, we finished the Zendo, then we had zero again. But based on that, we could then get a construction loan for the residence. So bottom line is sort of slowly, painfully slowly, through grassroots donations, we were able to build up property that would enable us to finance the final building. And now we have a mortgage that we're paying off and a fully functioning monastery. So it took us 15 years.
Mm-hmm. And did you have I don't know if there were disciples through this? Had you ordained anybody? Did you have any full-time Zen students prior to Korenji that helped you do this?
Well, I had people assisting me, certainly,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't have, I had my own students by then, before Korenji opened,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't ordain anyone. No, I take that back. I ordained a few people in Germany, but I didn't have anyone sort of on the ground here in Wisconsin doing this work with me every day. No, not until Korenji actually opened as a monastery. We have Unsui there, and now some of them have been there for 4 years now and are helping to take on administrative roles and things.
I once saw you post something. I feel like I'm a decent Zen teacher, but it's been a struggle being an abbot. Could you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
about that experience?
Well, I had no idea what it would be like. Korenji is a small place, so for the first few years, I lived there full time with the students. I have a small room across the hall from where the room is where my residents, my students lived.
Mm-hmm.
So to be in such close quarters, which is not normal for a Zen monastery, abbot's quarters are usually more separate. I found it to be incredibly difficult, partly because I am introverted. I can give a lot of energy out to students, but then I need to go someplace to recharge.
Mm-hmm.
And in Korenji, if I live there full time, I don't have that. So that part was difficult. But also just the interpersonal dynamics of the students living in the monastery and the way they project onto the teacher. I have a bunch of students who don't get along with each other, and then all of them, one by one individual, are coming to me like the kindergarten teacher to talk about the other. That kind of stuff I just hate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not good at it. And I will tend to err on the side of being authoritarian and dismissive in those situations. So it's been a real learning process for me. To keep my own boundaries and stay healthy and preserve my energy so I can do the job, to know when to let them just stew and deal with their own stuff. It's part psychotherapist, part drill instructor, part accountant, part web designer. I've done all of these things all at the same time. I had no idea it was going to be like that. So.
You mentioned the residents not getting along. So I don't have extensive residential experience. I lived at a Soto, I guess you call it a monastery, for about a year. And by far the hardest part was the other people. I've kind of described it like, imagine that you had to live, work with, and just 20, take your coworkers that maybe you have to deal with for 8 hours a day, but then you get to leave and not. But imagine living with them and practicing with them, and a lot of people who show up at a monastery are sometimes going through difficult life transitions and so forth. So there's a lot of energy and stuff, and it was rough, but looking back on it, I feel like there's a lot of learning there, and I've since someone mentioned the analogy of a bunch of rocks in a tumbler kind of bumping up against each other, so is that part of your just kind of letting them stew, is kind of allowing that dynamic to happen? Or
and by nature I'm a fixer. I have a little bit of a white knight complex, so if there's something untoward going on or people having difficulties, I want to get my hands in it and fix it. So I've had to pull back from that so that they can have that experience of polishing each other. And it's hard. I guess the closest thing it might be comparable to is like a boot camp experience, but it's a boot camp where you stay with the same people for a long, 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 long time. You don't get out of it after a few months or something like that. So when it's done positively, when they're able to use the situation well with each other, they develop good lines of communication. And of course, they're not supposed to be talking unnecessarily anyway. We're in silence most of the time anyway, which I'm always amazed they have so many problems where people aren't supposed to be talking to each other. I could never understand that.
Well, a lot of communication is body language. It's
but you've got your Koan, you've got enough to do. Why pay attention to it? I don't understand, honestly. I just don't get it. But anyway, when they do it well, There can be conflict, but there's also a deep camaraderie and a deep feeling of, mutually rowing this ship forward together that starts to come out. When it's not done well and you see people start to undermine each other, or worse, they project their own struggles onto the other person as if the other person's responsible for their inner world. That's when it can become a little poisonous. And sometimes someone has to withdraw. Sometimes you have to remove someone. I tend to trust people's, the better angels of their nature, and that they will be able to work it out. If they can't, I also have to learn to let go and just say that person right now, maybe it's not the best time for them to be here. And that's hard for me too, because I want to fix it. I want everyone to succeed. So,
Is it, I mean, are people upset when you ask them to leave? Is that a major, or do they kind of see it coming?
so far, I haven't had to kick anyone out.
Okay.
I have made the conditions for them to want to leave.
Yeah.
Not, I'll just leave it at that. If someone shouldn't be there, I want them to see and understand why, and to share that conclusion. So far, I think that has been successful.
And how long do you typically want someone to practice with you before you would consider giving them Ensui, or ordaining them and making them Ensui?
Well, Ensui just simply means someone, a priest who's living in the temple.
Right, but I mean, but you're ordaining them. So, like, how deep do you want that relationship to be prior to the ordination and them becoming formally your student, your disciple?
Someone can become my student anytime if I feel there's an affinity.
I guess I'm confusing it with the terminology, but
no problem.
How long until you ordain someone?
Yes. How long do I want them to train before I ordain them?
Yeah.
Yeah. It really depends on the person, but the general rule, if someone is suited to the monastery training, I want them to live there at least a year to have the novice ordination. The initial ordination is called shomei. It's a novice. At least 1 year in the sodo, in the temple, or in the monastery. There could be someone who I don't stick to that for. If I have someone who's older, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they have a depth of training background already, and they're a trustworthy person, and I believe that they will make a good priest. They can use it to help people. I can ordain that person, no problem. I'm not going to say, sorry, you're not young enough to live in the sodo, so no ordination for you. That's not the case. But the general rule is someone who wants to ordain as a Rinzai Zen priest, they should, if possible, have the residential practice experience. So if they're suited to it, I want them to stay at least a year. And come in, do Tango-ryo and Niwazume, which are the traditional entrance tests. Stay there for 2 Ango and 2 Seikan periods, which means 8 Dai Sesshin during that time, at least that 1 year minimum. Then I feel comfortable.
Your Dai Sesshin, can you talk a little bit about what your schedule is like, when you guys wake up, when you guys go to bed? Is there night sitting?
Yeah. Wake up at 4:30. 4:30 is Kaijo. And by 5 o'clock they're in the Zendo. Bedtime is midnight during this Dai Sesshin, but for hour and a half before that is Yaza, the solitary night sitting. And actually, in the traditional Soto schedule, a lot of people don't know this. We have the 1 week Dai Sesshin. Each Ango, each monastic term is 3.5 months. And during that term, there are 4 Dai Sesshin. Okay, so there's 4 weeks which are Dai Sesshin. But the weeks before and after Dai Sesshin are also Sesshin. It's called Sho Sesshin, small Sesshin. Purpose of the week before is to get ready for Dai Sesshin. Then you have Dai Sesshin. Then the purpose of the Sesshin after Dai Sesshin is to cultivate and carry what you cultivated during Dai Sesshin, or to integrate it. So Sho Sesshin weeks, which bracket Dai Sesshin, are just a little less rigorous. There's maybe an hour less sitting. Otherwise, it's Sesshin. What it means is that in the Sodo, they're more or less in a Sesshin schedule 3 weeks out of every. With those wake up and bedtimes.
It's funny. When I lived at the Soto monastery, and the teacher I worked with, he was really in the sitting. So just during a regular Ango week, day, I think we were doing like 6 hours of sitting. So when Sesshin would come, I'd hardly notice it. You know, it was just
Yeah, yeah.
and so I definitely see the advantage of that. Now when I go to sesshin, it's like, oh my God, this is a nightmare.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, like during the 1 week every month during Ango, which is not Shoseshin or Dai Session, that's a so-called normal week. Yeah, it's about 4 hours of sitting. So they actually do have the 1 week, which is kind of recharge.
Do you guys do the maybe it's a Soto thing where days with 4s and 9s are rest days?
Shikunichi days, yeah. So yeah, that's a Rinzai monastic thing too. Those are the days where you would take care of personal needs. You have a little break. You bathe, you shave, all that kind of stuff. We originally did set that, but it just became awkward. And in this culture, we're set up very much on a 7-day week, right? So what we finally settled upon, rather than the 4 and 9 days, we have transition days, the days in between Shoseshin and Dai Seshin and Shoseshin and the down weeks. Those are kind of those days. So end result is they get 3 or 4 days a month where they have a little less structure. They can go to town, run errands, they can wash their clothes, that kind of stuff. It's the same principle.
Okay. I want to be respectful of your time. We've been talking for a while, but before we go, I'd like to talk a little bit about residential versus lay practice, if you'd be comfortable talking about that. So, so obviously, you're one of the few places in America that's really offering a traditional, hardcore residential Zen practice. I mean, I think you can count them on one hand in this country that are offering that type of experience. You obviously value that experience, and clearly it's extremely efficacious for Zen practice. But do you work with lay people that are not don't come frequently to the center? Like, I imagine you don't offer Dokusan through Zoom or anything like that, right?
No, we don't do it through Zoom. Our understanding in our lineage of what Dokusan is, it's not possible to do through Zoom. I just have to say that clearly. I know some people do, and I don't mean to critique them, but I have to say I will never do that.
Yeah.
But I have many students. Most of my students are lay, and we have many sitting groups connected to Korenji. I have a lot of students in Europe, for example. We have students around the country. Most of them are not priests and will never live in the monastery. So there's no problem. I do Dokusan with them, but we do Dokusan when we see each other face to face. That's the limitation.
So if there are going to be, let's say there's 3 months between seeing them, are they just working on the same koan?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I usually tell people, listen, if you have some kind of profound experience, you can get in touch with me. Or certainly if you have some problem, get in touch with me. If I know the person deeply, I've worked for them or worked with them for some years, it could be I could discern something happened. But even then, I would usually wait until the next time I see them to clarify it and maybe to see what the next koan they would work on might be, and so on and so forth. And the good thing is, in Europe, we have sesshin twice a year now. We have sesshin 8 times a year here. Anyone can come to Korenji even outside of sesshin. I'm traveling constantly. There are plenty of chances to meet. So it's not really a limitation, I think.
In the Sambo Zen lineage, you're familiar with that, of course,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
So one of their teachers was once telling me, we were just chatting informally, that regardless of someone's previous Zen experience, they want someone to have a fresh awakening to move on with the koan practice. Doesn't matter what their previous experience. They want a fresh one that they can take that energy and move forward. Do you have a similar standard? Or let's say you start working with someone who's older, who lived in that Rinzai monastery in New York, let's say 20 years ago, and had a decisive opening, but then went and lived their life, and now they become your student. Do you work with that, or do you expect them to, or do you want them to kind of have a fresh?
Oh, I would never set such a rule. Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me to have an absolute rule like that. And if someone had a clear awakening, clearly had this experiential arising we call kensho, or recognition, and have continued to train using that as the basis, we'll just continue that. It's no problem.
So I lied. There's actually one more thing I want to talk about.
That's okay. I'm not in a rush.
So if you look at Zen's history, starting in Tang China, is it Tang or Tang? I always forget.
Tang Dynasty, yeah.
Tang. You look at the history and then its transition to Japan and its long history in Japan. What allowed Zen as an institution to survive was it always had its core. It had its core, group of hardcore practitioners who are working towards awakening and living the monastic life and continuing on the lineage and so forth. But to allow it to exist as an entity, as an institutional structure, they had to provide some service to the lay world. Whether it was validating that some rulers rule, or that ruler donates money to a prestigious teacher, which shows that he's prestigious himself because the teacher recognizes him, so it helps establishes him as a ruler, or providing ghost festivals for the villagers, or
rituals for the success of the state.
Yeah, or come chant at my grandmother's memorial tablet. And in Japan, very much it's become a funeral type business, like the country temples. And so, it becomes this kind of symbiotic thing where they provide basically services of comfort to, the population, the Danka, the lay people at large. In exchange, there's financial support to support the, the more ascetic, monastic type experience. What's interesting in America, that pretty much everyone who's involved with Zen is looking for awakening. Maybe they don't articulate it that well, but that's that way, but that's kind of how it works. And I'm curious how you kind of, and this is kind of almost like a sociological question, but but it's also a relevant question for you because you have a Zen institution and you need to support it. In the long run, what do you see? I'm sorry, this is such a long-winded preamble to a question, but in the long run, what do you see as the relationship between Zen and hardcore practicing towards awakening, and its kind of relationship to society at large? Do you see a role for Zen to offer kind of comfort style services to the population at large, kind of have that symbiotic, allow us to exist type of thing? Or do you think it's always going to be kind of is now where, someone works for a while, gets some money, they can pay the money for the ongo, then they go, where it's, there really is no larger kind of Donka or Sangha that's kind of supporting them financially in exchange for really what's just comfort, Does the question make sense? I know this is a really
Yeah, I
long
think so. I mean, and what you described, the relationship between the ordained Sangha or the so-called hardcore practitioners, as you said, and the lay world, that relationship has always existed from the beginning of Buddhism. They have always existed in relationship to one another, and not just in terms of the one providing comfort to the other, but also the ordained Sangha serving as the field of merit, for merit making or for connection with the teachings and edification and so on. I mean, there's many levels to it, right? But it's always been that way, and it is still that way. I mean, Korinji is built. It's a small, relatively small place. We have 17 acres. It's not a huge facility. It's nothing fancy. We're set up to have about 6 to 8 people living there full time. That's it. But the rest of the people who come in are people with varying levels of involvement in Zen. Some people come there to go to Obon and pray for their grandparents who passed away, or to say a prayer for the pet who's buried in our little memorial garden, that kind of thing. That kind of stuff is important. We have to give people as many creative and diverse contact points with the Dharma that we can, and that there's no problem. But now if we're talking about so-called hardcore practitioners, I don't care if they're ordained or lay. An ordained person has a different vocation. It's not a title, certainly. It's a job. They have duties, some of which are to be that person providing those services to those people. That's an important job. But again, just getting back to the quest for awakening, whether one is ordained or lay, there's no limitation at all. There are different vocations, there are different paths. But what I would want to stress is that the conceit that one can be a lay person and not go all in, not practice so intensively that their so-called normal life it's still normal. I mean, I don't know if I said that clearly. The so-called normal life, practicing Zen in everyday life for a layperson, that life is not going to be normal. When we look at the really accomplished lay practitioners through history that we hold up as examples, in Tang Dynasty China, Rokoji, layman Pa, for example. He was a Buddhist layperson, a successful merchant. One day took all his belongings, sank them in a river. Then he, his wife, and his daughter wandered around the country weaving baskets to make a subsistence lifestyle, visiting Zen masters and training intensively, training sometimes in one place for years before moving on. In other words, they structured their life around practice rather than practice around their lives. That to me is the cardinal rule. Okay, so he may be an extreme example. I don't think everyone has to go put their stuff on a raft and sink it in a river. But are you structuring, as a layperson, I would ask anyone, are you structuring your life around practice? And that may mean you are not able to do some of the things other lay people do. It may mean you need to structure a family life that is understanding of that. And if you don't have that, it's a limitation. It's a limitation. We just have to face it. But are you doing that? Is practice using this short life, transient life, to go as profoundly into the path as you can? Is practice the center? Is that your center? Or is it something that you're doing in sort of in a hobbyist manner, along with the many other things that revolve around your life? The life has to be centered on practice rather than practice something that is just a small piece of one's life. That is the same for ordained or lay people everywhere. The only difference between them ultimately is what their job is. What are their daily duties?
Yeah.
Ordained people are the face of something. Lay people don't have that burden of the robe I mentioned.
Yeah.
But the training doesn't have to be different. I mean, Omori Roshi, who trained for many years as a layperson before he became a priest, he was going to every sesshin all year long with a wife and a kid. Yamoku Teshu, great accomplished layperson in the Meiji period, 19th century. He was also a sword teacher, also an accomplished artist, a man of many gifts, also involved in the politics of the day. He was a government official. He didn't sleep. He would do his daily duties, and then he would sit, maybe sleep 2 hours a night, get up in the morning, sit again. He lived that life of intensive focus on practice. There's no getting around that at all. So again, there's kind of this conceit in Western Zen that, I can, Zen in daily life is fine, I can do that. What kind of daily life will you really have if you're serious about Zen practice? I want people to think about that and consider that. There's no getting around that. Is practice the center of your life? Have you structured your life around practice? Or have you structured practice as best you can around the rest of your life? That's a difference between a practitioner and a non-practitioner. It doesn't matter if they're lay or ordained.
Great, beautiful, thank you. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, what's your preferred mechanism?
Email. Email through our website, korinji.org.
Okay.
And apologies in advance if we don't always answer quickly because we have a lot of stuff going on, but we will.
And you guys run the Rinzai Facebook group as well.
Yeah, we've got great people on there from many different backgrounds. People like Corey, for example, and other people who have extensive experience of practice. People like Dosho Port Roshi, who has yet another perspective to bring. Great folks there. So come hang out and chat with us.
Great. And I wanted to get a little bit more into the energetic work. So maybe I could have you back in a couple months.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconception about that stuff, so no problem.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.